Tell us about the 10th Amendment and the significance.
All right. Well, you know, when you talk about the Constitution, and people talk about a lot of different parts, and there's depending upon who you talk to, they'll have different opinions on what the most important part. Some people will say the First Amendment is the most important. You know, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and well, as long as you have a free press, they can, you know, sound the alarm and the citizens can stay informed. And then you know, some other people will say the Second Amendment, specifically traditional conservatives especially, will say the Second Amendment is most important. It's most important to have an armed citizenry. As long as the citizenry stays armed and they're an army in and of themselves, then the federal government will have to abide by what the citizens want them to do. And then other people, especially you know, libertarians, will mention the Ninth Amendment. Ninth Amendment is my personal favorite with the way it's worded. It says that just because the Bill of Rights has enumerated certain powers doesn't mean, or certain rights to the citizens, doesn't mean that the citizens don't have all their natural rights. And then you come to the 10th Amendment. And the difference is all three of the ones that I just mentioned require the federal government to actually limit themselves. They require that the federal government will actually abide by the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Ninth Amendment. But the fact is the federal government doesn't abide by those things. The 10th Amendment, on the other hand, actually has a policeman, so to speak. It's the enforcement mechanism of the Constitution. The state governments, through nullification, interposition, have the necessary sovereignty to step in to limit the federal government. Whereas with the First, Second, and Ninth Amendments, we're basically giving piece of paper to the federal government and saying, okay, we'll go live by this, but nobody's going to be checking up on you. Of course, the federal government isn't going to live by it. There's nobody going to enforce it. And for the people that think that maybe the Supreme Court will enforce it, well, the Supreme Court's part of the federal government. Of course they're not going to enforce it. If I have, you know, if I am deciding if I can have some power or not have power, and I am aggrandized by having more power, then I'm going to decide I'm going to take more power. The Supreme Court has that authority if we view the Constitution without the 10th Amendment, without interposition or nullification. The 10th Amendment...
Twice now you've mentioned the word nullification. What does that mean exactly? What's the significance of that? I get a feeling that that's a big part of this.
So yeah, nullification is a big part of what we do at the 10th Amendment Center. And what basically, in a nutshell, nullification is when the federal government passes a law that is not authorized by the Constitution. A state passes a law saying it's illegal to enforce that unconstitutional law within their state boundaries. You know, and what that does is that prevents the federal government from exercising unconstitutional powers if enough states do it. Now, you look at the Second Amendment is the only other amendment that has anything that can be viewed as enforcement ability. But in order for the Second Amendment to enforce the Constitution on the government, you actually have to have an armed insurrection. With the 10th Amendment, though, you actually have the force of your state that you're residing in stepping in against the force of the federal government to ensure that liberty reigns in your state, and the federal government has to live by the Constitution. So I think that pretty much, in a nutshell, is why I believe that the 10th Amendment is the most important of the Bill of Rights and is really the most important part of the Constitution, and why we focus on that at the 10th Amendment Center, because we believe that by working within the state governments, we will be able to enforce the Constitution on the federal government.
Okay, so this nullification power that you're mentioning, where a state can simply refuse to go along with a federal law that is clearly unconstitutional, the power in that comes when you have a lot of states that go along with this. When enough states nullify it by these actions based on the 10th Amendment rights, essentially the federal government won't have the authority, won't have the capacity to go in. They may claim the authority, they may do whatever they wish, but they simply can't come in and take over all the states and,
Right.
and make them do it. They have to have the tacit agreement of the states to enforce the laws, and if enough states don't, then they simply, it effectively becomes a moot point.
That's right. That's right. And a good example of that would be the Real ID law. It was passed into law in I think 2005 or 2006, and as of now, over 24 states have nullified it, meaning that it's actually a law. It's the established law of the land, but nobody's doing it because without the states, cooperating with the federal government. The federal government doesn't have the necessary police power to go into each individual state and enforce that law.
Now, with each state, it seems to me, just as an average citizen, that an individual will have a greater capacity to influence political things on the state level rather than the federal level. And seems to me that is a great way for Americans who disagree with what's going on, with the overreach of the federal government into areas that they do not have the authority to. It seems like a great tool, like you said, short of an armed insurrection, but yet the people can actually step up and seize the power that the federal government does not rightfully have.
That's very, very true. And you can see the increased representation at the state level just by looking at the numbers in the House and the Senate. So in Oregon, we have 5 representatives in the federal House, and we have 2 senators in the federal House. So we have 7 people in Washington, D.C. representing us. However, here at the state level, we have 60 representatives in the state House and 30 senators in the House. So we have 90 people representing us at the state level. Same amount of people represented by 90 or represented by 7. I think it's pretty obvious at which place you're more represented.
And clearly, like I said, the proximity of the people being within the state,
Yes.
you will have a much more significant impact. The average citizen can have a greater impact, and thus this 10th Amendment seems very powerful.
Yes.
I mean, the Second Amendment, I'm a big fan of that. I really hold my gun ownership rights dear, but that doesn't really give you the ability to impact government. I mean, just by the right, the fact that you have a gun, without using it. We don't want to go there. This is the teeth that the average citizen has.
Absolutely.
Without having to resort to something ugly like violence. I think this is something a lot of people need to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about it, if for everything to be run the way Washington, D.C. wants it to be run, you would have to say that every area is exactly the same as Washington, D.C. So if all of our governors are governing from Washington, D.C., that means that every citizen is living in a city that is very much like Washington, D.C. And obviously, in Oregon, none of us live in a city that's a lot like Washington, D.C. We live in, the closest thing would be Portland, but that's a very small part of the state. In general, most of Oregon rather, is farmers, and most of Washington is city dwellers. And a lot of our Washington, D.C. representatives, there's one that I know for sure from Oregon that doesn't even live in Oregon anymore. He lives in New York. So we're looking at this and trying to decide, should Oregon be governed from Salem, our capital, or should we be governed from Washington, D.C., over 3,000 miles away with only 7 residents that have even seen Oregon, most likely?